All right, we are now in Ezra chapter 5. Ezra chapter 5. And of course, the main lesson from Ezra chapter 4 is that there's always going to be opposition to God's work, regardless of where the work is being done. There's always going to be opposition because Satan is behind it all. And Satan can use people or groups of people or nations or governments to try and stop the good works that are being done. And we saw that last week very clearly in Ezra chapter 4, where they went to the government to get the work stopped on rebuilding the temple. And the work stopped. And so now in Ezra chapter 5, we're going to see where it's going to begin. So, Ezra chapter 5, verse 1 says, "When the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophets, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel, who was over them." And we're going to look at Haggai and Zechariah in just a minute. And I need to get those pages out that I wrote down some notes on from those, because it's really important, because Haggai and Zechariah are two prophets who are prophesying during this time period. Haggai only prophesies, if you go to his book, and we'll read a few verses here in a minute, he only prophesies for about 4 months, somewhere around 520 BC. So his prophecy is not very long, but he was one of those prophets, kind of like Amos, who was really straightforward. I mean, he just told people exactly what they needed to do. Whereas Zechariah prophesies for like a couple of years during the same time period. But remember, and it's been a long time since we studied Zechariah, but Zechariah, he had lots of visions and lots of images in his book. So very different, but it just shows God uses all kinds of people to accomplish his good. So let's read. Let's go to Haggai first. And let's go to chapter 1. I should have had this marked, but I didn't. Chapter 1, and if someone would read, let's see, verses 1 through 4, gives us an idea of Haggai's time period and what kind of prophet he was. Haggai chapter 1, verses 1 through 4.
In the second year of King Darius, in the 6th month, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came to Haggai the prophet, to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak the high priest, saying, "Thus speaks the Lord of hosts, saying, this people says, the time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built." Then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in your paneled houses, and this temple to lie in ruins? Now, therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways.
All right. So that gives us a little idea what the prophet is saying. And notice he's really direct, really straightforward. And he says the people are saying it's not time to rebuild the Lord's house, the temple. So a lot of the people are saying, no, we're not going, this isn't the time to build the Lord's temple, the Lord's house. And so Haggai comes back and says, is it more important for you to build your own houses and let the temple lie in ruins? So we see what kind of prophet Haggai is. He doesn't mess around. He just is super direct. He says, what's more important? The Lord's house or your house? And of course, it's a rhetorical question. The Lord's house is more important than your own houses. Well, Zechariah, if we go to Zechariah chapter 1, we see what kind of prophet he is. And if someone would read Zechariah 1, verses 14 through 16. And he starts prophesying about the same time that Haggai does, which is around Ezra chapter 5. Zechariah chapter 1, verses 14 through 16.
So the angel who spoke with me said to me, Proclaim, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, I am zealous for Jerusalem and for Zion with great zeal. I am exceedingly angry with the nations at ease. For I was a little angry, and they helped, but with evil intent. Therefore, thus says the Lord, I am returning to Jerusalem with mercy. My house shall be built in it, says the Lord of hosts, and a surveyor's line shall be stretched out over Jerusalem.
Okay, and he goes on, if we look at the rest of Zechariah, and he has lots of visions about the rebuilding of the temple and how it's going to be done and so forth, the pattern. But his is all about visions. He has visions of horses, the measuring line, and so forth. So very different as far as their style, but the message was the same. And that was that the rebuilding of the temple is the most important thing to do because that's going to restore the worship. And restoring worship was the most important thing. More important than the city, more important than the people's houses. What was important was the temple, getting it rebuilt, getting back to worship, getting back to having the feast days and all of that. So all of that was very, very important. And that's what they needed to do. So God raises up these two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, and they have a profound effect on the people. So sometimes, it just shows that sometimes God raises people up at certain periods of time to get certain works done. And that's what he did with Haggai and Zechariah. He got these two guys with their messages. One prophesied for 4 months, the other about a couple of years. And it really got the people encouraged and motivated and moving in the right direction to get God's work done. And it was very, very important. And these two prophets, they challenged the people, they motivated the people, they energized the people. So all of those things, and they were very, they did a super job in getting that done. Because, we go back to Ezra 5, verse 2 says, in talking about those same two people, so Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, rose up. And remember, these were the two main guys at the time that were leading the people, and began to build the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And the prophets of God were with them, helping them. So see, during the time that Zerubbabel and Jeshua are getting the people organized to rebuild the temple, well, Haggai and Zechariah are right there motivating, encouraging, helping them to get this work done. So these prophets had work that they needed to do, but it was God's work. It was God's work. So that's what is happening. The people are getting back, and they're actually starting to get the work done, the work of rebuilding the temple. So we move on to verse 3. And it says, at the same time. So now we have some other characters. We had some characters in chapter 4 that were trying to get the work stopped. Now we have some new people. At the same time, Tattenai, the governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-boznai and their companions came to them and spoke thus to them, who has commanded you to build this temple and finish this wall? So this Tattenai was a governor, a ruler over a certain region. And he came, he hears about this, so he comes with this other person. We don't know, exactly what the other person's job was. Maybe he was second in command or something. But what do? They come because they have heard that these people who came back to Judah and Jerusalem are rebuilding the temple. So they come and ask, who has commanded you to build this temple and finish this wall? Who has done this? So they're wanting to know, who gave you permission? Okay, who is behind this? Who gave you authority? Who gave you the power to come back here and rebuild the temple and the wall? And whether he's talking about the wall of Jerusalem or the wall of the temple, it doesn't really say. But the primary point here is he's wanting to know who gave them permission. So they see the work, so they're questioning authority. So he says then, verse 4, then accordingly we told them the names of the men who were constructing this building. So Zerubbabel and Josadak, they're the leaders of God's people, and so they respond and tell them, all the people that's involved in rebuilding and what they're doing. And what's important is what he says in verse 5. But the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, so they could not make them cease till a report could go to Darius. Then a written answer was returned concerning this matter. We see, again, God working. God is the one behind this as far as getting this work done. All right, getting this work done on the temple. And they weren't going to cease until a report would come back from Darius. Of course, he was the leader. He was the main guy. So, what would they do? They send a letter. Okay? They send a letter to, you might say, the man in charge. And several years have gone by now, by the time verse 5 has come. You can see how my week has gone. All right. So, this is a copy of the letter that Tattenai sent. The governor of the region beyond the river and Shethar-boznai and his companions, the Persians who were in the region beyond the river, to Darius the king. They sent a letter to him in which was written thus, to Darius the king, all peace. Let it be known to the king that we went into the province of Judea to the temple of the great God, which is being built with heavy stones, and timber is being laid in the walls. And this work goes on diligently and prospers in their hands. This is why I think he's talking about the walls of the temple, not the walls of Jerusalem. So they're being built. And I think this is part of the psychology of the letter. Because he's talking about, he's writing to the king and he says, they're being built with heavy stones. Meaning this is going to be a massive building. And timber is being laid in the walls. And this work goes on diligently and prospers in their hands. This would be one of those instances where it'd be nice to see his face when he was writing the letter. His expressions. What was he really intending with the letter? And so we've got this letter and he is saying, okay, look here. This is different than the letter from chapter 4 with those other men, but still it's about the work of rebuilding the temple. I mean, that's what it's about. It seems to have a different tone than the first letter. Remember, from Ezra 4 was pretty vicious. This one doesn't seem to have that degree, anyway, that the letter in chapter 4 did. And so he goes on, verse 9. Then we asked those elders and spoke to them, who commanded you to build this temple and to finish these walls? We also asked them their names to inform you that we might write the names of the men who were chief among them. So he was wanting to get details. He was wanting to get particulars about who all was involved in rebuilding this temple. I mean, who was doing it? The Jews, they're working very hard, and this Tattenai and the others see that the Jews are working really hard. It's really important to them to get this temple built, this house of the Lord, as Tattenai says, this great God. And again, was he being facetious? Was he acknowledging Jehovah? What was behind him saying the great God? Well, all we have are the words. We don't know his attitude or his spirit when he's writing those words. But he's definitely concerned. And he says that's why we went to the leaders, the elders, and asked them, who's doing this? Who's reconstructing or who's building this temple? Who's responsible for this? And what caused it? Again, we don't know. We don't know who all was behind it. Maybe some of those same Samaritans were behind it. We don't know. So they do know that the Jews are very zealous. They're wanting to get this rebuilt. So, verse 11, and thus they returned to us an answer saying, so this is Zerubbabel and Jeshua. This is how they responded to Tattenai, the governor, and so forth. We are the servants of the God of heaven and earth. And we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and completed. There is some very significant things in that response. First of all, Zerubbabel and Jeshua are saying, we're not the servants of just a God. We're not the servants of just any old God. We're the servants of the God of heaven and earth. In other words, Zerubbabel and Jeshua are saying, we are really servants of the one true God. And of course, these other people worshipped all different kinds of gods. But Zerubbabel came back and said, no, we worship the one true God, the God of all the heavens and the earth. And we're rebuilding a temple that was built many years ago. So we're rebuilding. He's not saying we're building something entirely different and new. He says we're rebuilding something here that used to be here years ago. So this is not anything brand new. We're rebuilding something that basically has been here for centuries. And then he says, which a great king of Israel built and completed. And of course, David and Solomon were the ones that were responsible. Solomon was actually the one that got it rebuilt. But the Zerubbabel and Jeshua they're responding to this with history. This is history. These are things that's happened in the past. There was a temple here, and it was here for a long time. A great king built it. A great king completed it. And verse 12 is also very significant in their response. But because our fathers provoked the God of heaven to wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this temple and carried the people away to Babylon. Now, why I think that's important is many people in history might have thought Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, because Nebuchadnezzar's God was greater than Jehovah. But Zerubbabel and Jesse were saying here, the reason Nebuchadnezzar was able to destroy this temple was not because of his God, but because the God of heaven was angered by the people's sins. So usually in the past, when you go back and read history, especially during these times, when one nation's army beat another nation's army, then it was because the one nation's army's God was stronger than the other nation's army's God. Here in the response, Zerubbabel was saying that's not the case. It was because the one God of heaven and earth was angered because of his people's sins. That's why he allowed Nebuchadnezzar to destroy this temple and carry the people away to Babylon. So that's why it happened. It wasn't due to the weakness of Jehovah. It was due to the weakness of the people. That's why. Well, it goes on. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to build this house of God. So again, he's going back in history and saying, the former king, before you, Darius, issued a decree. We read it all the way back in the first chapter about that allowed God's people to return to Jerusalem, allowed them to rebuild the temple, and even gave them many possessions to do that with. So he's saying, you may not be aware of this, Darius, but this is what happened in the past. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple that was in Jerusalem and carried into the temple of Babylon, those King Cyrus took from the temple of Babylon, and they were given to one named Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. And we don't know a lot about this Sheshbazzar. He may have been an older person that came back that was helpful in the rebuilding of the temple. We're not given a whole lot of information. But anyway, what was important was that Cyrus gave all of that gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar had taken, gave it back to the Jewish people so they could take it back to their homeland. And he said to them, verse 15, take these articles, go carry them to the temple site that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its former site. So let it be rebuilt there in Jerusalem where it was before. And again, this is really significant in what is going on in these times. So the former ruler, Cyrus, had done all of this for God's people. Allowed them to take all of this gold and silver, which would have been, a lot of articles. Allowed them to take it back to Jerusalem and allowed them to rebuild this house of God. So what Zerubbabel was doing in this response, which ended up in the letter to Darius, was saying the former reigning king, Cyrus, was the one that allowed all this to happen. Well, let's see what goes on next. Then the same Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundation of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. But from that time even until now, it has been under construction and it is not finished. Okay? It is not finished. Still relaying that same story. All right? The foundation was laid. Remember we talked about that in the former chapters. The foundation was laid, but that's really as far as they got there at the beginning. So he said, yeah, the foundation was laid, but the temple is not finished. And of course, it wasn't anywhere near being finished yet. So he ends up in verse 17, now therefore, if it seems good to the king, let a search be made in the king's treasure house, which is there in Babylon, whether it is so that a decree was issued by King Cyrus to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send us his pleasure concerning this matter. So what the letter basically ended up saying was, go look in your history books. Go look in your history books and see if this was really true. Did Cyrus really issue this decree? Did Cyrus really say that these people could go and rebuild the temple? And did the king really give them all of this gold and silver? So you go look in your history books and see if this is true or not. And that's basically how the letter ends. Was this something that really happened, or didn't it? And so the work is going to continue. The work is going to continue. So Darius, just going on a little bit, we're almost out of time. So what happens is, next verse of chapter 6, then King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives, where the treasures were stored in Babylon. And, that's what he should have done. He should have went to the archives, the history books, and so he tells his servants, basically the people who work for them, you go search the archives of all these decrees made by the previous kings to see whether this permission was granted or not. And probably the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem probably wasn't a big deal to Darius. He was like the world leader. So a small group of people in Judah building a temple probably wasn't a big deal to him. Very doubtful. So here's what they find. And at Achmetha, in the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found, and in it a record was written thus. In the first year of King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where they offered sacrifices. And let the foundations of it be firmly laid, its height 60 cubits and its width 60 cubits, with 3 rows of heavy stones and 1 row of new timber. Let the expenses be paid from the king's treasury. Also let the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple which is in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and taken back to the temple which is in Jerusalem, each to its place, and deposit them in the house of God. So this decree concerning the temple and rebuilding of the temple and how it was to be rebuilt and allowing the gold and silver articles to be returned actually existed just as the Jews claimed it did. And so they were shown to be doing exactly what they had been allowed to do. Well, our time's about up. We'll stop there. Lord willing, we'll get back in to verse 6 next week.